it's working.
Yep. You see the presentation rather than present view?
I see the presentation, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, and what a fabulous keynote to start off the.
Oh yeah, amazing stuff.
Yeah, I'm sorely tempted to go completely off script and just respond to provocations, but I will try my best to at least stay in time.
I'll definitely give you a 5-minute warning if it's getting there, but I think we'll be fine.
Great, thank you.
So I'll wait for Tim and Huda to come, and then we'll get started promptly at 9.
Good morning, everybody. This is Tracy.
Hey Tracy, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, thanks. So yeah, if you want to just kind of help me monitor the chat, and then we'll relay those Q&A at the end of each session. And then, yeah, if something, if my computer dies or something, then you'll be automatically made host.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I was moderating a session yesterday, and we took questions as they came in the chat, but we didn't have a Q&A option. So I was just curious about, balancing the flow of the presentation with, I guess, clarifying questions should be addressed as we go. Yeah.
I was thinking, it's kind of up to the presenters, but I was thinking mostly we would just we'd let people ask questions as it's going, but we would save the question and answer session for right after the presentation.
Okay.
I think that might be a little bit more, help us keep on time a little bit better. So let's try that. And then if there's a need for something else, we can try that.
Okay.
For my part, I have the chat open. So if people do put questions in, I can try to address them. Okay. Either at the end or in the flow. Okay, yeah, if there's a question that's like, we can't hear you or something like that, then I'll just, but, or if there's an urgent need, I'll let you know, but otherwise we can try to think for the end.
Hey, Tim.
Hi all, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Eric, do you have, is there a title slide or should I
There
bring
will
my slides up?
Oh, no, it's okay. There is a title slide. I'm just waiting for Huda to get here so I can promote her, and then I'll share my screen with that, if that's okay.
Sure. Do you mind if I quickly test my screen share?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks.
Looks like that's working.
Okay. Do you see the slideshow or the presenter's view?
I see the slideshow.
Okay, great.
Hi, Huda.
Hello.
How's it going?
All right. How are you?
Pretty good. So yeah, we're all set to go. So we'll start promptly at 9 with Tim and Rob's, and then you'll go second. And then do you want to test your sharing abilities right now, or do you feel confident? Or
I can go ahead and test it real quick if that's all right.
sure, yeah.
You should see a slide.
Yep. Looks good.
Okay.
All right. Great. I think we're all ready. And yeah, I'll start the recording right at 9.
Good. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Huda.
Morning. Huda, my name is Tracy. I'm going to be watching the chat. I was just curious if you had any preferences around your answering questions, my collecting a few. How do if you have any?
Whatever works for you. If there are like lots of questions midway through, I could stop. But yeah, yeah, we can just wait out the half hour and then collecting questions is fine.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing you say is instead of my like interrupting and asking, we'll just wait a bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you think if a half hour is really long, we could do like a 2-minute break in the middle somewhere, and I could just be like, we can take some questions now, if that's what you're thinking.
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to be helpful. So I mean, there's time for Q&A at the end. I just know sometimes people ask questions as they're going, and you know, at the time.
Yeah, I think maybe waiting would be good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Tracy, could you give me permissions to record? Or you could hit record yourself. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hope you can all hear me all right. And welcome to this session of the LD4 conference on two presentations, one on LUX at Yale and another one on discovery and linked data for production. My name is Eric Radio, and I'll be moderating this session along with Tracy McCormick. Just wanted you to know that this session is being live streamed to the LD4 YouTube channel, and it's going to be recorded for future viewing. On this slide, you'll see several links of interest. One is for the conference website, the code of conduct, the Twitter account, and the hashtag if you'd like to tweet at that. There's also a Slack channel for us to for you to communicate as well with other participants. If you're running into any problems with tech or getting into sessions, please ping that channel in the Slack channel. And then for more on this collaborative project, that last link down there. For these sessions, we'll be asking you to put questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll go through those after each presentation. And then finally, I'd like to introduce our first session and speakers. I'll let Tim share, but our first presentation is LUX, which is Illuminating the Collections of Yale's Museums, Libraries, and Archives via Linked Open Usable Data. Tim Thompson is the librarian for applied metadata research at the Yale University Library. As a metadata practitioner, his work focuses on the implementation of linked data standards and technologies in academic libraries. He currently co-chairs the Linked Data Advisory Committee of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. Since 2016, he has also been involved in efforts to develop a BibFrame ontology extension for the description of art and rare materials, which is known as ARM. He's joined by Robert Sanderson, who is the Director for Cultural Heritage Metadata at Yale University, where he works to ensure the availability of the organization's content in usable ways via open standards, including linked open data and IIIF. He is a leader in several international efforts in the information science world, including IIIF, semantic standards in the W3C, and cultural heritage specific models. So I'll turn it over to them now. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be. And thank you for attending today's session. We'll be speaking about a multi-year effort at Yale University to create a new cross-collection discovery environment that is being designed using the principles of linked open usable data, or LOUD. And I'll begin by sharing some institutional background to contextualize our project, and we'll then focus on the idea of frameworks and their importance in this kind of collaborative, multidisciplinary initiative. I'll speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll then hand it over to Rob, who will present his work with LOUD in the context of the linked art community, and we'll end by looking at our current work and next steps at Yale. Cross-collection discovery at Yale involves 4 collecting units: the Yale University Art Gallery, the Center for British Art, the University Library, and the Peabody Museum of Natural History. Each of these units is distinctive in its own way and plays an integral role in the intellectual and cultural life of the university. The gallery is the oldest university art museum in the United States. The Center for British Art contains the largest collection of British art outside the United Kingdom. The library is one of the largest academic libraries in North America and includes special collections, repositories such as the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, pictured here. And the Natural History Museum contains extensive anthropological, specimen, and fossil collections that are of historical and scientific importance. Of course, distinctive collections and services are wonderful, but when they are intertwined with distinct organizational cultures, distinct collection management systems and databases, and distinct data models and metadata standards, it can be challenging to achieve the goals of cross-collection, collaboration, and discovery. Being distinct often entails operating in a distinct, separate silo. Now is not the first time that a vision for cross-collection discovery has been championed at Yale. In 2008, the Office of Digital Assets and Infrastructure was established to create common solutions for digital asset management, preservation, and discovery across the university with the focus on the museums and the Beinecke Library. The work of this office set an important precedent for collaboration across Yale's collecting units, but its activities came to an end around 2012. Jump forward to 2015, when the university librarian, Susan Gibbons, began a secondary assignment as the Deputy Provost for Collections and Scholarly Communication. In this new role, her responsibilities included support for the university's museums, and she was charged with promoting new opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration across Yale's collecting units, in acknowledgement of the importance of collections to the teaching and research mission of the university. In 2017, Yale hired a new chief information officer who instituted a governance model for information technology services at Yale based on 5 core areas or pillars. Cultural heritage IT was recognized as a key institutional priority for investment and support. Each pillar in the IT governance model is overseen by a steering committee, and the steering committee for Cultural Heritage IT, or CHIT for short, is chaired by Susan Gibbons and charged with overseeing support, infrastructure, storage, and development platforms for the collection, curation, dissemination, and preservation of Yale's cultural heritage assets. So bolstered by these organizational changes, the CHIT collaboration, which is the umbrella initiative for Yale's cross-collection discovery project, was launched in 2018. New groups were formed for coordinating the collaboration and implementing technical solutions. As its first order of business, the collaboration revisited the earlier work that had been done by the Office of Digital Assets and Infrastructure. Digital asset management solutions were upgraded, and the International Image Interoperability Framework, or IIIF, was implemented as a cross-collection standard for digital content delivery. In 2019, the CHIT collaboration gained further traction when Susan Gibbons when she transitioned from her role as university librarian to a new appointment as the vice provost for collections and scholarly communication. A dedicated project manager was hired to coordinate the collaboration, which had begun to grow in size and complexity, and development of a new platform for cross-collection discovery began in earnest with a 2-day workshop facilitated by consultants at Design for Context. During the workshop, an extensive list of requirements was generated for version 1.0 of the platform. In 2020, Yale received a grant from the Mellon Foundation to support collaboration across libraries and museums. This funding arrived at a critical point when resources for many initiatives had been frozen because of the pandemic, and made it possible to hire Rob Sanderson as the Director for Cultural Heritage Metadata, responsible for coordinating foundational work around data modeling and reconciliation. Finally, this year, a task force was convened to undertake an extensive review of software solutions to power the cross-collection discovery platform. For further background on the history and evolution of cross-collection discovery at Yale, I refer you to a comprehensive overview that our colleague Larry Gall at the Natural History Museum gave earlier this year. So now we arrive at LUX, or light, from the Latin motto of the university, which is the name that's been given to Yale's new integrated discovery platform. The mission of LUX is to be a transformative service that allows users to explore the whole of Yale's physical and digital collections through a single interface, one that highlights points of convergence across Yale's distinctive collections and collecting units. The development of an organizational and institutional framework has been critical to the consolidation of this cross-collection discovery effort. As the project has grown and matured, new committees and groups have been formed. This framework for collaboration has allowed for more systematic reflection on the goals and challenges of cross-collection discovery. For example, a bias awareness and responsibility committee has been formed to develop an ethical framework for the project, recognizing that a platform like LUX exposes longstanding and deep bias within our acquisition activities, collection systems, and descriptive practices. Although LUX benefits from a solid framework for collaboration, a framework for implementation has been somewhat more difficult to achieve or define. Going back again to the erstwhile Office of Digital Assets and Infrastructure, it had in fact developed its own cross-collection discovery platform focused on digital content at Yale. This platform was built using open source solutions, including Apache Solr and the ViewFind search engine. For that effort, units had developed a metadata mapping to a common Solr schema for the different standards, the different metadata standards used across Yale's collecting units. When the LUX metadata working group was convened, it began by reviewing this legacy mapping and iteratively revising it based on LUX 1.0 requirements. By the end of 2020, the group had cycled through 9 different versions of across collections metadata mapping. From a flat Solr schema, the group began to identify common entities and group them into fields. Here you can see different groupings identified for notes, languages, and agents. Metadata and technical experts from each unit produced a common JSON representation of their respective catalogs and databases, a total of 15 million metadata documents, which was then fed into a proof of concept blacklight instance for further exploration. Of course, one of the core challenges of cross-collection discovery is the sheer diversity of content and formats represented by these different collecting units. Starting from a list of content types and formats that had been developed for the legacy system, the metadata working group has worked to align and harmonize concepts and categories across collections. The legacy schema included a mixture of content types and formats, which has been distilled in our latest version into a set of 10 content types and 5 formats. In the past, I've heard linked data standards and technologies described as a solution in search of a problem. However, our initial experience with developing prototypes and metadata mappings for LUX has revealed the limitations of legacy approaches based on full text search alone. As our metadata schema evolved, it became clear that a more robust framework, one that incorporated graph-based approaches, was needed in order to implement our vision for the project. In short, to be realized, a vision needs an underlying structure to support it. On a basic level, we need a framework that incorporates ontology, methodology, and technology in an integrated way, with a mental model that informs our operations, which in turn define the requirements for our applications. Thankfully, when Rob came to Yale, he brought with him not only a wealth of knowledge and experience, but also a coherent framework for implementation. And I'll now turn it over to him to talk about what that entails.
Thank you, Tim. Let me just quickly share my screen. Start the presentation. Here we are. So after such an engaging and provoking keynote, I feel very much engaged and provoked. So I will try to stay on time at the very least, but hopefully I'll be able to address some of the points that have come up to continue that conversation. So one of the aspects that we felt was extremely important for LUX was that the data should be as usable as possible. What do we mean by usable? Well, courtesy of Wikipedia, usability is the degree to which a thing can be used by specific consumers to achieve their quantified objectives with effectiveness, efficiency, satisfaction, and in a quantified context of use. So who, what, how, and where. The important thing to note, of course, is that usability is dependent on the audience. And in the keynote, I noted in the chat that a lot of our purpose, or our shared purposes, were around publishing data and not about consuming data. So who is the audience for linked open data? You might think, well, the audience is clearly researchers, particularly in an academic context. But I would argue that there is an intermediate between the data and the researcher, which is the developer. Most researchers, unless they are developers themselves, interact with data via discovery interfaces and other systems that can interpret to some degree the ones and zeros that we publish. So given that the audience for the data is developers, we need to consider how they will be able to be effective and efficient in their use of our data. You might also think of this in the concept of APIs. So as the Australians say, when it comes to APIs, developers are your users. The same principles of user-centered design apply to the development and publication of APIs, such as simplicity, obviousness, fit for purpose, and so forth. The W3C also has a very similar take. The W3C is focused around standardization via generating consensus, and they have a priority of constituencies, slightly tongue-twistery, but in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over theoretical purity. So to apply that to linked open data, of course, the W3C set of specifications, the users are developers, as we just discussed. The authors, therefore, are ourselves, publishers, data editors. The implementers would be tool builders or product builders, and theoretical purity is, of course, the ontology. So it may be quite unnerving to hear someone with a background in data modeling and ontology saying that ontology is the least important aspect of our work. So here is the trade-off that I think we all need to consider, both in terms of LUX at Yale, but across the community, which is as we add completeness to our data, and be that different viewpoints, more deep and rich expressions of our knowledge, the usability starts initially to grow, but then it trails off, and as we get towards being extremely complete, the usability of the data is essentially zero because of its complexity. So what we need to be doing is targeting this area where we've maximized the area under that graph. So, for example, we could aim to be back here, where we would be very usable, but not very complete. So this could be something like the AAA presentation API, which is linked data, but it is not semantic in any way. We could aim to be down here in the bottom corner, where this could be, a complete expression of BibFrame or CIDOC-CRM with all of its extensions, but you would need a PhD in order to understand that data or to have produced it yourself. So instead, we want to be somewhere in the middle, where we've maximized both usability and completeness at the same time. David asks if there are any particular developers of any consuming product for whatever reason. And that could be another publishing system, such as enhancing data in your own systems. We also have a notion of progressive enhancement. So we can start off, such as in the AAA presentation API, with data intended for humans. It can still be linked data, but the entities are searchable with textual descriptions and labels, but very little structured data, such as dimensions or materials. We can then move on to data for machines, which would add more structure that could then be compared across instances and hopefully across institutions. Then data for the graph, or distributed, if you'll forgive me, where the entities are connected both within and across systems. And only finally do we get to data for research, where the data is accurate and comprehensive enough to be able to answer research questions once we have aggregated the data together across different systems. To apply that back to our usability versus completeness trade-off, there should be the possibility of picking this point on the graph within an application. But if we don't need that level completeness, the same model, the same structures should be able to give us increasing usability without going to a completely different ontology. So in order to come to such a pattern, we, as Tim was saying, we need a framework in order to think about how to do this across both natural history and art museums, across libraries and archives, all within one coherent framework that makes sense to both the publishers, the different units, the consumers being a central group in ITS that will be building the user interface, and the users of that interface, of course, the researchers and general public. To this end, we have three different abstract standards. The conceptual model, which is a way of thinking about the world in a consistent way across cultural heritage. The ontology, which is the shared set of terms to encode that thinking in a machine actionable way. And vocabularies, which allow us to be more specific about particular terms within cultural heritage, such as the distinction between a manuscript and a printed book, between a painting and a letter, or between a sculpture and a digital 3D model. We can then move from there into implementation standards as opposed to abstraction standards, which we split into two parts. Profile or metadata application profile, as maybe the longer, more familiar term, which is a selection of the appropriate abstractions there to the left, which encode the scope or the boundaries of what can be described. So with LUX and indeed with linked art, we don't intend to describe absolutely everything. We intend to be able to reflect the knowledge of the units in their collection management systems out in a coherent way to the rest of the world. The data, once encoded in that profile using the abstraction standards, then needs to be delivered. So to come back to APIs, an API in this way of thinking is the selection of appropriate technologies that can give access to the data. So the profile is about managing the boundaries of scope, and the API is about managing boundaries that we reflected on in the discussion about boundaries of data and conceptualization in a more mathematical sense, I think someone said in the chat. So, oops, sorry. Where are the boundaries for the linked art profile? The domain is cultural heritage, but especially focused around artwork, given the name and genesis of it. The model, we do not use BibFrame. We use the CIDOC conceptual reference model, which is more capable of expressing both the museum, library, and archival content. The ontology is an RDFS-based encoding of CRM 7.1 with some minor extensions. But the vocabulary that we use is primarily Getty AAT as the most coherent vocabulary that we could find that covered both the museum artwork data and the library and archival concepts. There are a few things that AAT is missing, which we have needed to add on top of it, but also we work, of course, with Getty to see if they can't make them official as well. Format, so in terms of the API, we use JSON LD with 10 primary document boundaries. I didn't change the slide, I promise. And the target for scope, it generally is 90% of the use cases, but only using 10% of the effort. So the conceptual model from sort of a very high level is activity-centric rather than object-centric. So the activity sits in the middle, then the what, when, how, who, and where come around the outside. So the what's are either physical things, such as the book in the library, the letter in the archive, the painting on the wall of the museum, the dinosaur skull in the Peabody, or conceptual information holding objects, such as the image, which is conveyed both by the digital image and the physical painting. equally the text of books that could be shared across different copies. This then instantly gives us some level of connectedness between physical and information objects. Those are then essentially connected through activities such as publishing, creation, painting, and so on. Activities, of course, have a when did the activity occur, which is modeled as a time span. How did it occur? So what was the techniques? What sort of thing is it? What's it classified as, which are types or concepts? Who carried out the activity? Was it a person or a group of people? And where did the activity take place? So then I said we have 10 main entity types. These are human-made objects, which we were very happy that the CIDOC-CRM SIG was willing to rename their previous name for this from man-made object to the less gendered human-made object. So these are the distinct physical things that you could go and touch, but of course, please don't go and touch the paintings. The linguistic objects are content in some human language that you could read or hear. So these are often texts, particularly in library and archive, but it could equally be a recording, either audio or video, such as the Holocaust testimonies in the Fortunoff archive that we held. A visual item is similar to a linguistic object, but it's the appearance of something that can be seen, such as the appearance of the zebra painting in the YCBA, which then could have other physical or digital copies that show the same image content. Digital objects are digital things that exist within a computer system, such as that digital object, but also born digital content. And finally, for the main entity types, there's set, which is an identifiable grouping of 0 or more of the previous entities. So a 0-length set could be things that we have intentionally destroyed. Or it could just be the set having lost a member temporarily and it's about to gain a new one. So we would use sets for archives and archival subdivisions, digital objects for digital images and born digital content, visual items for the way that things appear, linguistic object for the texts that are held or carried by the physical books, letters and so on, and human-made objects are, of course, the physical holdings. We then have 5 connected entity types, or in a library sense, you may wish to consider these authority types, such as person, so this is a human, alive or dead, a group, which is one or more persons or other groups that act collectively somehow, such as an organization, family, meeting, or conference, a place, which is a geospatial extent, which you could describe using coordinates, a concept, which is a conceptual thing often used to characterize or classify, so this would be AAT or LCSH, and events. So these could be macro level events such as wars that then of course prompt provenance work. They could be the provenance activities themselves. They could be destructive events such as the fire that destroyed the Brazilian museum, thereby causing the destruction of many objects. Why have we gone this route? So one of the use cases that was explored in the workshop held by Design for Context was how, essentially coming up with a bunch of questions that we want the system to be able to answer for us once it's complete. And one of the ones that really stood out to us in terms of demonstrating the value of linked open data and the use of this particular model was, how did European artists paint the American West during the 1800s? So that's easy to ask, but it's less easy to answer without a strong domain model and enriched reconciled set of data. I'll try and demonstrate why. So here's the model. You've heard all of these terms almost. So here's the physical object on the left. It shows the image content which represents a place. It's classified using some concept. In this case, it will be painting. It was produced by the activity of producing the object, which was carried out by some person who was born at some point in some event, which took place somewhere. So using this pattern, we should be able to answer the question. So we can fill it out with that particular object's values. So the art gallery's physical object with accession number 1931-389 is classified as being a painting. So there's our paints. It shows an image, which could be shown also by the digitization of it, which represents a place, Yosemite. It was produced in circa 1873 by Bierstadt, who was born in Germany. So this gets us a little bit of the way there, but we still don't know that Yosemite is part of the American West, or that Germany even is part of Europe. So the first step, of course, is to reconcile those entities with external concepts, such as TGN 7017628 being Yosemite, or 70084 being Germany. We can then use those reconciled entities to enhance our data by adding in information from those trusted sources, such as that Yosemite is part of California, Germany is part of Europe. If we knew that California was then, I ran out of space on the slide, part of the American West, we would be able to completely answer the question of how did European artists paint the American West in the 1800s. So LUX-wise, where are we in terms of current work and where we're going? So we have 15 million records from our systems, which are then expressed as about 45 million entities in this model. We use JSON-LD for those expressions, and that is after merging and reconciling internally across the different systems. This works out to be about 2.5 billion triples, which of course is a reasonable number. It's not disastrous, but it's not trivial either. We have chosen to limit our reconciliation and enhancement to some trusted sources, particularly from Getty, Library of Congress, OCLC, and Wikidata, with the vocabularies used as shown in the slide. Currently, the process to build those 45 million entities is to take the final version of the Solr-based implementation, which was just sort of pure JSON designed to go quickly into Solr, and convert that into JSON-LD using the linked Dart profile. We then go off and reconcile it and enhance the data from those external sources. So it is a little bit of a game of telephone at the moment. However, the efforts and the units at the moment to take that conversion from V9 and apply it natively against their systems of record, so that we don't have such a stringy system. Technology-wise, we are working with a vendor, and the licensing agreements are not quite finished, so we can't say who that is. But we evaluated 6 technical stacks before making the selection, where some of which were multi-system, multi-model solutions with various implementations being stitched together. Some were more single solution and trying to get as efficient as possible in one area. We ended up selecting a single system that can manage JSON-LD as documents and also as triples. So this gives us the best of both worlds in terms of having effective search based on documents and effective graph query based on those triples. Our current architecture is 316 vCPU AWS nodes that work together to answer queries. It takes about 14 hours to load and index the 45 million entities, but after that, most of the queries can be done in less than a second, even some of the complex graph queries that we came up with to try to challenge the system. The biggest challenge that we've had, however, is if the query is in Sparkle as a graph query, then generating a faceted user interface that the end user expects based on the results of that query is entirely, unfortunately, non-trivial. So with that, thank you very much for choosing to attend. There was a selection of panels and discussions to go to, so thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to ours. I believe that we have about 10 minutes left for questions and further discussion.
Yep, that's correct. Thanks so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I believe our first question is, what kinds of tools and workflows do you use for enhancement and reconciliation? How much human intervention and quality control activity is baked into that?
Yep. So at the moment, the reconciliation and enhancement, sorry, let me answer the two questions separately. Reconciliation is done by people, essentially. So the different units have, as part of the Mellon grant, some funding towards employing undergraduates and postgraduate students to help find external identifiers for the entities and add them into the system of record. Of course, units have also been doing that in various ways. Library has backstage processing. The curators and catalogers add in identifiers when they're describing the objects to begin with. So we do only minimal automated reconciliation because the chances of it going wrong for people in particular are horrendous, and the results would be catastrophic to the quality of the data. However, once we have some even student vetted identifier, we can then use the interconnections between the vocabularies to pull in more information about that entity. So for example, at the moment, we're working on the Library of Congress classification numbers, which in the MARC records is just the LC class. So letter, number, which to an end user is almost worthless as a concept. However, LCSH has some correlations, so we can sometimes find them. FAST has some correlations, and sometimes either with the LC classifications or with LCSH, and Wikidata has some correlations as well. So long as we can find one identifier, we can often find more and pull in information automatically from any of those systems. From there, we can then have hierarchies built automatically, be they groups or taxonomies from the Natural History Museum, concept hierarchies, place hierarchies, and so forth, such as in the example query, pulling in Europe as the broader term for Germany and California for Yosemite.
All right, thank you. A couple more questions coming in. Next one is, are you reconciling and enhancing the data on the fly? If the data is cached, how are you keeping it in sync with the source?
Yep, yes, that's an excellent question. Yes, thank you, Lynette. So we are not doing it on the fly, so to speak. So the workflow currently is a pipeline that takes the version 9 data from the units, transforms it into linked Dart, looks for the external authority URIs, goes off and fetches that record if we don't have it cached already, and then interprets the record into linked Dart and merges the interpreted record with the current record. That, of course, has to be done iteratively because one system may know of identifiers for other systems. LCSH has links to Wikidata, Wikidata has links to AAT, AAT might have a link to FAST, so you sort of have to crawl the graph, which In terms of the discussion about how close are we to the original vision for the semantic web, some systems are trying it, I think successfully, compared to others that are more centralized. So the data is cached for performance. Of course, if we have 45 million entities, it would take 45 million years to do all of the enhancements against all of the remote systems. However, most of the systems are available as downloads, so we can simply run them locally and work against a local copy. So then we know how out of sync we are, I guess, simply by when we downloaded the dump file. And then, yes, one way that we would very much like to keep in sync with the source is by using the IIIF change discovery API, which is sort of a supercharged linked data based OAI PMH, where you can keep in sync at an individual record level with remote systems based on the URI of the entity rather than Dublin core metadata.
Great. Next question has to do with, you showed an example with a text date as circa, and they're wondering if you have a more linked data-centric way of handling dates with ambiguity that perhaps you didn't mention.
Yep, so this is still, it's maybe not 50,000 feet, but it's still about 1,000 feet. So there is quite a lot of additional structure below here to describe what circa 1873 means as a string in a comparable way. So moving it from data for humans into data for machines. So we would use the begin of the begin, the end of the end, a classification to say that it's approximate, but still retain this CA.space1873 as a label to render to humans who understand what that means. Whereas you can do search and comparison with the exact date times, but it's hard to interpret those date times quickly if you're just looking through a long list of ISO 8601 fields. So we try to keep it usable for machines and usable for humans at the same time. One thing we do not try to do is to quantify the certainty. How circa is it? We think that's one step too far, and it is very, very subjective data that a machine or even another human is not going to be able to process in any meaningful way. So we record the circa, but we don't try to guess what the curator was thinking about that circa-ness.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question. So their next question is, they're curious about the makeup and size of your working groups that were working on this, and any UX testing you did, what departments and roles have been involved, and was UX involved in the development of the metadata model?
Tim, do you want to take the first part, at least?
Sure, I can give it a try. So I believe there are currently around 50 stakeholders involved in our different groups and committees. And it's as a fairly complex project across multiple units. There are a lot of stakeholders who need to be heard. So some of the groups are quite large. I believe the metadata working group right now has about 20 participants, if I'm not mistaken. So and that's where the project manager role has been really critical, to being able to coordinate and keep these different groups in sync, and kind of apprised of the what each is doing. The program group, the cross collection discovery program group, also serves that function and includes folks who are in public services, curators also. The diversity of perspectives has been important in the makeup of the groups, and UX testing. Some initial UX testing was done in preliminary stages of the project, especially around labeling and concepts, kind of reality checks for the intelligibility of the language that was being presented to users in wireframes and mockups. But a lot of additional UX work is dependent on the implementation of our platform. So that's will be soon to come. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Rob.
Only very briefly that the metadata group and the UI group in the slide are separate, but there is a lot of overlap, and they all sort of report back up into the CCD, Cross Collections Discovery group. So there is representatives. It's maybe not as deep a connection as we might like on both sides. Yeah, there's always, of course, the limits of time and availability for meetings with such a broad set of stakeholders and groups.
All right, thank you so much again for this presentation. Might be time for more at the end of the next presentation, but our next presentation is From Prototypes to Production, the continuing story of discovery in the linked data for production closing the loop grant. This is being presented by Huda Khan, who is a software UX developer at Cornell University. She is interested in the design and architecture of linked data systems and how these systems can better meet user needs.
I hope everyone can hear me. We good? Hello?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so thank you for the intro. I really should come up with shorter titles, but as you'll see, we'll be talking about our sort of journey of discovery and what we've learned so far and are working on right now in the current grant. So a question that usually comes up as when you try to explain what you're doing is why are you doing it? So we'll begin with a little background and motivation and talk about the approach we've taken. And then we'll talk about the specific examples of work that has either been already incorporated into our production system, is being explored, or is really at the very preliminary stages of research. So there's one example each of those. And the very not romantic bullet for checklists is, hopefully we'll get to that. We will be able to talk about the sorts of questions and suggestions we may have for other people who are also interested in using linked data for discovery. And then they're really around how to analyze the problem. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions if I don't. Sorry, apparently the smoke alarm has just gone off in my house. But I do have family downstairs who I hope will be addressing that. Okay, so hopefully that's not too annoying for you. For background and motivation, so when we talk about library catalogs, we tend to, people designing them and the people using them tend to think in terms of what we call node item search, which is you have probably a specific title in mind or a specific author in mind. And what we are trying to explore in the context of these grants and more generally is how to support more open-ended discovery. So how can we bring in information around context, around subjects and people, so people can understand what it is that they're looking for. They can find interesting relationships to other authors, to other works. And also we want to be able to take this sort of gap, which I'll talk about in a minute, between the way that we tend to describe information specifically in library metadata and the way that library catalog end users might be thinking about what they would like to look at. Another aspect of the work we're looking at is the understanding that there are going to be relationships of interest in the bibliographic metadata, but there might be sets of or data that is useful for discovery that doesn't really belong within the bibliographic metadata itself, but that can be retrieved from elsewhere. And I think the previous presentation sort of is using that as well. So these are some slides that sort of show what we have right now in some of our systems, which is we have a book or some kind of work, and we use authorized strings or authorized headings to link out to authors and subjects. And if this is one way of looking at it, which is we're using these sets, these control sets in order to identify who wrote Lincoln of the Bardo and what the subject is. And what we want to be able to do is see if we can use the linked data versions of these data sources and start to make out connections using those to other data sources, which include but are not limited to Wikidata. And in this process, can we bring back information for context? Can we bring back information around interesting relationships to other resources and really get at helping the user? So I mentioned the grants. I think they're mentioned in the title. So this work is part of the Linked Data for Production Closing the Loop grant, which in itself is extending the discovery work we did in the previous grant, the Linked Data for Pathways to Implementation. And in this grant, we're really focusing on trying to see what it will take to finally close the loop. Or in other words, can we create a working model of a complete cycle of library metadata creation, sharing, and reuse? And the work that we'll talk about in this presentation is focusing on the discovery aspect. So I do want to make sure that I thank all the people that have been involved both in the previous grant and the current one in discovery specifically, and then our core group of people who include developers, metadata experts, and UX people who really are at the forefront of a lot of these discussions and conversations and decisions we're making as part of this, part of these experiments. So that's a little bit background as far as design and development. What's the approach we're taking? And so I will share, or perhaps someone already has shared the link to the slides in the chat. There are additional slides around the UX research, but I'm just going to go over very quickly to say that we really tried to use the user-centered design process to understand this problem space and then to create experimental prototypes that we then further evaluate. So here's a quick overview of some aspects of the user experience process, with the idea being that this is a very iterative process. We keep trying to learn and design and refine. I will get back to these questions later, but for now, these just provide an overview of the main kinds of areas of analysis that we have in mind when we approach any of these particular prototyping tasks. And I'll talk about that for each a little bit, but the three main facets of analysis that we often think of are who are our users and what kind of use cases or requirements are we trying to support for them? What kind of relevant data sources provide points of connection that could be of use? And then how will we implement it? Is this going to be real-time queries occurring on the client side, or do we need to do something a little bit fancier? So I'll get into that in a bit. There are slides in here that talk more about the UX work that's been done with Astrid Usong and her collaborators at Stanford and here at Cornell. And Emma Betcher as well did some really great analysis with researchers at the time at University of Chicago. I just want to highlight a few takeaways that are useful for us to consider as we try to think about what's the best way to really help our catalog end users and what can linked data provide us in that context. So there is a mismatch, as I sort of alluded to before, between the way that catalog vocabularies are set up and what a user might expect to be able to do. And this can cause some friction. So one approach is to try to take that into mind and see what options we can provide users that can allow them to understand the context and the meaning of their search results or of what particular work they might be looking at. And there are different needs between experienced researchers and inexperienced researchers, but it is also important to note that even with experienced researchers, some of their work may be interdisciplinary, which means that there might be areas that they require more help in, and whatever we can do in that area will be helpful for both inexperienced and more experienced researchers. And everybody loves a good browsing experience. I think those of us that have seen how we've had to resort to digital experiences alone and not be able to browse bookshelves can speak to that. So just some food for thought as we go through this. I'm not going to go through a full recap of all the work we did in LD4P2. I believe last year's conference presentation should have that fairly well handled. But I did want to quickly point out the kinds of questions we were interested in included being able to provide context around entities, support navigation using the kind of relationships and information about resources from the external sources that we could get, and provide suggestions. And this is useful because, as I said, LD4P3 continues some of the same approach of experimentation and prototyping. So we have a research track where I'll talk a little bit about one of the examples from there. And then we're also calling it a production track. We have a section of work where we're focusing on how to bring some of these ideas into our production systems. And that has multiple areas of analysis, which includes, very importantly, having the necessary conversations and really being able to work with the people who are in charge of maintaining and developing our catalog, both the software and the metadata. So the three areas I'll talk about in LD4P3 are author and subject pages and Discogs and works and instances. The first is an exploratory phase still, but getting close to one where we're going to start having the necessary conversations. The second is already in production, and the third is very nascent. So starting with author and subject pages, I mentioned that in LD4P2, we looked at context and being able to provide context around entities. And one of the areas we looked at was knowledge panels, which allow you to see information about an author and subject more comprehensively as you're looking at your search results or as you're looking at an item in the catalog. So we thought of that and we said, can we sort of up that, put that on steroids, make the entity a first order object in the catalog and a non-work entity, because the main items that are being searched in the catalog are already first order objects. But is it possible to take the information about authors and subjects and pull it from the catalog, from other data sources, from other related collections in the library, and provide a page that really highlights information about that entity and then links back to catalog search results? And here are examples from other systems or from other library systems that have tried to incorporate ideas similar to this. I'm not going to go through them here, but feel free to check them out on your own. So this is an example here where the user has come in and is looking at Middlemarch, written by George Eliot, and they click the info button. And so just to back up, this is an example from the prototype that we've built at Cornell. And when they click on the info button, they get a streamlined version of a knowledge panel that gives them some information, but not everything. And it includes a view full record button. So once they click on that, they go to this page, which focuses on authors, and it tells them information about George Eliot, including place of birth and where George Eliot was educated. It also has a right-hand section that is pulling in information about library holdings and search results. And on the bottom, you see this publication timeline that's taking information from Wikidata and presenting it in this fashion so people can see which books were written by George Eliot and when. There's also an influences tab that shows them an influence graph, and this again is being pulled from Wikidata. So they get a sense of which other authors might be related to George Eliot. And that's a quick overview of the author page. We also worked on a prototype for subject pages. So here the user is looking at the Russo-Japanese War, a book about the Russo-Japanese War, and they've clicked on the info button next to the subject, where they can then view the full record. And this takes them to a page that's incorporating information from multiple sources. The top part, which includes a description from Wikidata, is also incorporating location and time info from period O. I'll talk about that in a second. It's incorporating broader and narrower subjects coming in from the Library of Congress. And it's also showing in the page itself the library catalog and digital collection and repository results from the Cornell Library. If they scroll further down, they'll see this timeline, which situates this particular event with respect to other events. In this case, they've hit display all subjects, so it's showing all the other subjects that we have information about, and they can also see where that event occurred. So if they click on it, they'll see a little panel here with some information, and the map will show them where that event occurred. And then they can click around on the timeline and see, for instance, that the Japan history Taisho period has these related subjects and has 68 works in the library catalog. So what you saw here included both client-side requests as well as separate indices that we'd set up, and a few different sources of information, including Wikidata, Period O, Library of Congress authorities, and our own internal authority information within the library catalog. So to talk about that a little bit here, here we have the author timeline. So if we start with the Library of Congress URI, you can get the Wikidata URI and then look for influence relationships. You can also find works that were authored by that author in Wikidata and get their publication dates. And this part fuels the publication timeline. And then information like image and description can also be incorporated. I believe in our current version, we're also pulling in DBpedia, or beginning to. The subject timeline, like I said, incorporates multiple sources of information. So it is using geographic and temporal information from Period O, which is a gazetteer. I believe they have a poster at the conference as well. And Period O will include information from the Library of Congress subject headings and say, for instance, that the Russo-Japanese War location is Russia and Japan, and will give you the Wikidata URIs for that, and will also give you the start and end dates for that event or for that subject. In addition, we're also querying the Library of Congress to get the separate components. So for instance, when you have Norway -- architecture -- 20th century, we're pulling out, for instance, Norway, being able to query Library of Congress and get the URI for that, and or get the date information from 20th century, and then pull that into the timeline. And once you have the Library of Congress URI, you can get the Wikidata URI, equivalent URI, and get the information back. And we're pushing this all into a Solr index that allows us to more easily bring that info up. So we did have some usability testing, and we got some user feedback. And there were features that people thought were interesting, including related concepts in the timeline. Although there were suggestions or feedback that demonstrated that there was additional clarity needed around the role of some of these data sources and the interaction between the map and timeline. And where we're at with this work is we're incorporating some of the feedback into enhancements. And we will be, we've already held one set of conversations with our stakeholders in charge of our library catalog. We will be returning to them with some additional design options and some enhancements, and hope to continue discussions with them around this and knowledge panels. So when I say stakeholders, what do I mean by that? Well, we have a group of people, different librarians that and staff members that are there to try to vet ideas and provide feedback as to what makes sense to include in the catalog. And we have a development team. And when I say we, I'm speaking specifically of Cornell University, and there are similar setups in other institutions, I'm sure. So Discogs is an example where we've actually incorporated our work into production. And it also is an example of the production conversations that I'm talking about, where we had conversations with a focus group. If Tracy Snyder is still on the call, shout out to her for her great feedback and advice on how to work on this area. And so to step back, what is Discogs? It is a source of musical information, artists, albums, songs, records, that is seems to be quite well regarded in the music cataloging community. And we had already experimented with bringing some information in from Discogs as part of our context work in LD4P2. So we were able to carry that along, again, thanks to Tim Worrell and our team here at Cornell, and be able to integrate that into the Cornell catalog after having these conversations. And this is what it looks like right now, where if you were to see an example of a musical recording, this is Two by Toot. You can see that the fields that are not in blue, those fields are information that's already in our catalog. And the other fields are coming in directly from Discogs. And this information is incorporated using one of two approaches. If there is an identifier from Discogs present in the metadata, it uses that. If not, it will do a search using specific fields and bring that information in. So again, thanks to Tim for that. We also have work that we're looking at. We've looked at authors and subject pages. We incorporated Discogs. And this is a very preliminary phase where we're beginning to try to ask this question and see where it takes us, which is if we have information about works and instances and the relationships between them, and if it's modeled in BibFrame or semantically somehow, can it provide useful information for discovery? And for that, we're looking at both use cases and design work already conducted in other areas, in other projects such as Share VDE, Project Reshare, and the Platform for Open Discovery, to better wrap our heads around how information which combines information from multiple works can be displayed effectively to end users without overwhelming them. And we're looking at the Library of Congress hubs, Share VDE opuses or OPI, whatever the plural is, and information that used to be encoded as work IDs in OCLC, but they're now reshaping that with the new entity backbone work. So these are just some questions we have, and if people have worked in this area and have suggestions, we would love to hear that. Before I go on to checklists, and I think we might be very close to time, does anyone have a question or two I can take really quickly?
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe I can just drop. So first one is, they love your inclusion of an influence data. What does that look like in the interface when the data is not available?
Yeah, so that's a great question, which Tim Worrell has already asked us, who is one of our developers. That tab, I think, simply does not show up. What you saw in the interface was multiple tabs. When the information is not there, we just do not show that tab.
All right, and the next question we have is, they're curious about Periodo and other spatial data from subject fields. Cornell has a long history of deploying fast. Are there any syncing or reconciling attempts when dates from Periodo and the fast chronology or the 648 field for an event are in conflict?
So what we did in that particular example is we do use fast at Cornell, and those do end up in our facets. In that particular example, we're actually taking the subject information from the page from related directly to the work that's LCSH for now, because Periodo has LCSH, and our individual works or resources have LCSH, we've used that. But that's a great question, and I would love to see that reconciliation happen in some fashion. I'm going to go ahead, if that's all right, and try to finish this part, and then maybe we'll have time for more questions. So thank you for those questions. So I just wanted to end, or we just wanted to end really quickly to kind of give a recap. I won't go into this in too much detail, but some of the things we've learned through our process, which I think we've been lucky because we've managed to be able to experiment and prototype and evaluate, and then bring those conversations back to the right people who really are in charge of our catalog and our user experience. We've thought about this with respect to several questions, and I mentioned this sort of multifaceted approach to analysis, trying to understand who our audience is, where our use cases might come from. So, you know, a way that we've approached this has been, let's just see if we can, what we can do to enhance the information in the catalog. And when we take this to our stakeholders, we're like, well, it's just a little neighborhood link data. But yes, there are several questions that we need to address as we do that. And I stole this from Instagram and Rear Window. You know, before we take a particular prototype and unleash it in our production systems, we need to make sure that there are certain requirements met with respect to production readiness. You know, we didn't really do a whole lot of work with accessibility, but that's very important. Are there software and UI testing techniques that are usually used in production systems or should be that we should consider? And data source dependencies, how and when should we define them? How and where should we define them? We should definitely know what they are, but we may also be required to, either by the data source provider or by our own stakeholders, to include the source in the display. So a note that says, you know, this information comes from Discogs, or this knowledge panel info is coming from Wikidata. And just like one of us asked, what's the what happens when the data isn't there? We have to be able to define that use case for ourselves and to know what the system will do when that information is not available. A shout out to our ethics in linked data working group and their work in this area. But you know, we've learned from them. I think from I believe it's the Fast AI group. And Steve Myers at UW-Madison. I'm not just doing this for name dropping, but they've all done a really good work trying to address this problem. What do you do when you have to deal with data that isn't necessarily what you want to display or should not be included? What kind of mechanisms do you have to deal with that at a system level? But also, how will you receive that feedback? And who will receive that feedback? And then who will you talk to? And what's the process? And so those are really good questions to ask before you actually incorporate any of this work into a production system. Understanding who is responsible for the answer or who might be able to help you with it, and always being open to having these conversations. There are links again here that once you have the link to the slides, you can go in and look at a lot of these other groups and conversations that are happening that might be of use to you. So hopefully we have like 2 minutes and we can still take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Huda. That was really fascinating. We have plenty of time for questions. One of them from the chat is, what is the thinking or UX testing behind the minimal use of subject system synthetic structure? For example, displaying only one of the many narrower terms.
I think that particular example only had one narrower term. So it wasn't that we were only showing one. If there are more, we don't want to overwhelm the page. We have examples that we actually have to work on right now, where it's got like 15 narrower terms, and then the entire page is just narrower terms. So some way to collapse or expand that. But we aren't picking just one and showing just one at the moment, unless you meant walking up and down the hierarchy. All the cases where the 1XX is a broader term are narrower terms. I'm sorry, I do not know how to parse that. And we can always follow up if that didn't answer the question.
Sure. So I have a sort of a question, but not exactly for you. In response to the question between reconciling Periodo and FAST, I believe that was what it was. They're wondering if they have examples of where the data is in conflict, and that there's going to be a poster later today on dates.
Okay.
This is for Jackie Shia, but maybe this is a good thing to put into Slack for further discussion. Another question is, were there any considerations about accessibility in terms of features like the timeline?
Yeah, that's something that we need to look at further. Like I mentioned, we didn't incorporate that into our sort of initial testing yet. But before we do anything carrying it forward, that's something definitely we will look at. And the timeline itself is using Histopedia, which is a separate library. I don't know if they have already done some work on accessibility, but that's a great question. And we will look into it.
And I think Stephen has clarified his question from earlier a little bit, like a 5xx broader term. So yes, walking up and down the hierarchy.
I think for now, we try to keep it simple because we do have certain design ideas regarding being able to maybe flip back and forth between broader and narrower. One of the, I don't know if I showed this appropriately past. And you can actually see there's a details button right next to broader and narrower. And the idea here is that if you want to learn more about Eastern Question, you would just click on the details button and then it would give you like more information. So you should be able to flip fairly quickly back and forth or up and down the hierarchy. But we just went with the sort of simplest approach for now. It'd be fascinating to see what we could do that could incorporate more of the hierarchy without overwhelming the user.
All right, any more questions either for Hudo or for Tim and Rob? Going once. All right, well, if there are no more immediate questions, again, I would refer you to the Slack channels for the conference to continue the discussion there. Thank you again to all of our presenters. These are two just fascinating presentations with a lot of stuff to consider and very applicable, I think, to many of us. So thank you so much to all three of you. And yeah, and I hope we'll all have a good rest of the conference, and we'll see you all in different presentations later on.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
All right, thanks, Tracy, for doing that. Something weird happened with my settings where I came back and it wouldn't let me do anything. So thanks for saving the day on that. And,
no problem.
I think that I'm not entirely sure where we're supposed to deposit those recordings. Probably somewhere in like a G drive folder, but I'm sure I'll look at my messages to see if I can find anything about that.
Okay. I guess so I'm going to get the recording, huh? As the host?
Yeah, I think you will.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, just let me know. And then you could always forward it to Michelle Futornik. And then if you want to also save the chat and the Q&A.
Oh yeah, good idea. Good idea. Save chat.
Oh, okay.
Oh, good.
Now that the recording just got directly published, so I think that you're off the hook.
I got this. I got the chat just in case.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Paloma. All right, and then yeah, just hold on to that chat, and we'll see if the conference organizers want to have that.
Sure.
Later. All right, I'm gonna end the meeting I'm going to leave the meeting, I guess. But yeah, thanks, Tracy.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
See you later.
Okay.